I'll commend you to the description, the biographical description that's on the website for the program for today. Very quickly, yes, I worked at the NAFTA Environment Commission in Montreal for 7 years. I'm actually an American who's taken refuge in Canada for the last 8 years. And prior to that, I worked for the U.S. Justice Department. I'm an environmental lawyer. And what's not mentioned, and what I'd like to mention, is that I'm also a co-author of a book that will be coming out in February by Barrett Kohler Publishers, the same publishers that published Confessions of an Economic Hitman. There's a flyer in the back about the book called Right Relationship Building a Whole Earth Economy. And I'm also here today as a Quaker. I was raised in a Quaker family in Western New York. So I'd like to give some perspective as a Quaker on some of the issues that are related to monetary reform. A more expanded presentation of what I'm going to talk about is in the book I just mentioned. That was written by a group of Quakers. Let me just tell you a little bit about the Quakers. There are about 400,000 Quakers worldwide. Quakers are a very decentralized religious group. In that the base of the meeting and the heart of a meeting for worship is the monthly meeting. That's a local meeting. For example, I was raised in Buffalo monthly meeting. Monthly meetings are then members of either quarterly or yearly meetings, which meet either quarterly or yearly, and develop faith and practice upward that way. In the United States, there are three main Quaker factions. One grouping is called Friends General Conference. This tends to be the most liberal, progressive group of friends. There are non-theist friends within Friends General Conference, just to tell you how far out it can get there. And then there are also Friends United, whatever the M stands for, ministry, I think. A grouping of meetings, and then conservative friends. And some of those meetings tend to be evangelical. The typical Quaker meeting is a non-structured meeting. It's a meeting for worship that takes place in silence with no leader, although some evangelical Quakers have pastors and are more structured. So there's a lot of variety, but the point is that it's generally decentralized, so there's no way I could be speaking on behalf of Quakers today. I can speak to you only as a Quaker. Now, historically, Quakers back in the 17th and 18th century in England were excluded from the professions. So they had to turn to lowly pursuits in industry and commerce, which means many of them got involved in the banking industry. Historically, I'm told, because I've not researched this myself, Quakers did not have a witness against usury in the sense of charging interest on loans at all. There is a history in Quakerism of taking stands against unusually high rates of interest. And certainly, in terms of the principles that are important in Quakerism, the kind of usury that takes advantage of people would certainly be inconsistent with the main strains of Quaker thought. I'm going to come at the question of monetary reform from an angle that's central to our book, Right Relationship, which is to some extent a perspective of ecology, ecological economics, and earth care. But as I'll mention as I go along, I think there is some convergence. While I can't point to many focused efforts in Quakerism right now to deal with monetary reform, there is a fairly widespread movement among Quakers to speak about earth care and about the current ecological crisis that's facing the earth. So I'll talk a little about that. And the other thing I want to mention is, at least in the Friends General Conference Quaker meetings, there are a set of principles called the SPICE principles. SPICE stands for simplicity, peace, integrity, community, how far did I get there? Community and equality. And integrity, both in the sense of truthfulness and oneness. And those are principles that underlie the Earth Care testimony, but really all other Quaker testimonies. And I think it's also relevant to the views that they would have on monetary reform. I will mention the book was sponsored by a group of which I'm on the board called the Quaker Institute for the Future, and a project within the Quaker Institute of the Future called the Moral Economy Project. The Quaker Institute for the Future is a Quaker think tank whose mission is to promote a global future of inclusion, social justice, and ecological integrity through participatory research and discernment. And one thing they do is have circles of discernment, which is mostly contained within Quakers. These are essentially meetings for worship or using Quaker process for discernment to come to some kind of consensus or unity on an issue. And there will be one of these circles of discernment coming up on monetary reform. So it is an area that has interest. On the other hand, I will tell you that in writing this book, which was also done through, in many senses, Quaker process and Quaker truth-seeking and discernment, the suggestion that we get into the monetary reform question, that's something that even this small group of Quakers could come to unity on in the time that we had to finish the book. So there is some work to do there. So what are the stakes, if that works? What are the stakes we're looking at? Well, we probably all remember, whoops. So what are the stakes we're dealing with? Well, we all remember this guy and the gruesome results that he led us to in 1977. So who are the Jim Joneses of today? I think you all recognize these people as well. Well, why do I say that they're basically involving us all in a suicide pact? Well, the evidence is growing. We're dealing with a time in our history, a first time in our history, where climate change is causing extreme changes in our ecology. This is the solar ice cap from 1979, represented by the yellow, in 2005 in the white. And here's the changes just in 2 years, between 2005 and 2007. And if you want to see more evidence, somebody mentioned Gus Speth, James Gus Speth, work. He's written a book this year that came out this year called The Bridge at the End of the World. Look at the spread of grass that he includes here just before the introduction. And if anyone wants to look at that after my talk, I'll be glad to show that to you. If you want to know the stakes and why we're on a track towards destruction as we're being led by the current leaders of the world, I think that the set of graphs will be very persuasive to you. So what we do in the book, we have this concept of right relationship, which has a long history in Quakerism, and we describe it by the quote you saw at the beginning. A thing is right if it enhances, preserves and enhances the integrity, resilience, and beauty of the commonwealth of life, and it is wrong when it tends otherwise. By commonwealth of life, we're adopting the notion that the humans are part of the ecological sphere, the interdependent community of life, of which the economy has to, the context in which the economy works. So we use that notion of right relationship and answer 5 questions. First, what's the economy for? How does it work? How big is too big? What's fair, and how should it be governed? And then we propose some solutions. So the first question, what's an economy for? Well, obviously, an economy can be used for all kinds of things. You can build pyramids, You can use it on major infrastructure, as with the roads and aqueducts in Rome. You can use it as the church, and especially the Roman Catholic Church, has done over the years to build the great cathedrals and churches of the world. And of course, as we know, you can use it for the destructive power of war. Well, in mainstream economics, the purpose that's put forth for the economy is to improve people's lives through increased consumption measured by disposable income while maintaining high employment, low inflation, and of course, above all, GDP growth as the predominant measure of success. The problem with GDP, as we heard a bit about yesterday, is it's a measure of activity, not of wealth. For example, declines in natural resources are not accounted for in GDP typically. It fails to count the cost of growth. GDP is taken as a measure of benefits. It's assumed to talk about only of revealing benefits when it actually includes benefits and costs. So for example, all of the cleanup that went into cleaning up after the Exxon Valdez, that counts as a benefit in GDP calculations. The trip to getting the ambulance to take an accident victim to the hospital, that's good because that adds to GDP. We don't look at that in context of what's really going on. It's indifferent to distribution of income, and it takes into account of the scale of the economy relative to the biosphere. And what we end up with is casino economy, driven to more and more depraved schemes to keep the engines of growth steaming ahead. The monetary system is but one reflection of how money in its most perverse forms of debt and credit is allowed to generate more and more false wealth. Today, it's not pyramids that we're using the economy for, but pyramid schemes. So in a whole earth economy, what we try to present in the book is a notion where we recall where the economy came from. The notion that you have to connect or reconnect the economy to the natural capital, the real wealth that it ultimately is derived from. We also have to reinvigorate concepts of respect for all life and the interconnectedness of all life, and of reciprocity that is reflected, for example, in the Golden Rule. We also have to relearn the lessons of the great thinkers of the axial age. Everyone from Confucius through Muhammad to Jesus to the ancient Jewish scholars who saw the spiritual poverty of wealth accumulation and warned of the usury problem. And we also have to look at the wisdom of indigenous cultures that learn to live within their means. We have to relearn the lessons of this wisdom and incorporate it into our economy, the way we run our economy. Ultimately, what we argue is that the economy, the purpose is for maintaining a thriving commonwealth of life. And an example we give, the economy is for maintaining a thriving commonwealth of life. And an example that we give is a community market in New Brunswick, which to us has a lot of elements of what we think a whole earth economy would be all about. An instance, although we don't say it, does not run the problem, does not create and have to deal with the problems of interest and debt that we've been talking about at this conference. One where a lot of the economy is run as locally as possible. How does the economy work? We think that we need to put the economy in its place. Ultimately, this means looking at the economy not as only an earthly economy, but an economy that must obey the laws of how the earth in fact works, and the laws of how the universe works. The dominant worldview today is that the social sphere and the ecosphere, called biofragments here, is a subset of the economy and the economy. These the social sphere and the ecological sphere are simply tools to be used to drive the economy ever bigger. So if you look at something like shrimp farming, the result is an accelerating wasting of the natural capital on which the economy depends. We pay for shrimp not in dollars by the pound, ultimately, but in terms of the long-term devastation that shrimp farming causes, for example, to coastal mangroves. That's just one of many examples. In a whole earth economy, the econosphere, the economy, would be put in its rightful place as a subset of the social sphere and the ecosphere. In a whole earth economy, the basic unit of wealth is not of a unit of currency like the dollar, but rather photosynthesis, the basic process fueled by the sun that is at the foundation of everything we and the rest of the species on the planet consume. This is the key to the thinking of ecological economists like Herman Daly, who we heard about earlier today, who concludes in the Common Good that was also mentioned today, that the culture of exponential growth that now dominates Western society and increasingly the world is not sustainable. To move away from this culture toward a culture capable of dealing with problems of non-growth would require us to tie money more closely to real wealth. So this is where we start, I think, tying in with the themes that are important in the monetary reform movement. When Aristotle talks about money not having real value compared to the things that it represents, it's the same concept, but tied ultimately to the limited ecological pie that we all have to deal with. In a whole earth economy, you have to have a new perspective on waste. There's no such thing as a byproduct, just a transformation from one thing to other things. In a whole earth economy, there is no such place as a way, as in throw it away. In a whole earth economy, we have to recast some economic terms. And let me pause here a little, because I think this is where our work and the work on monetary reform comes together. The concern that Quakers and other religious groups have had with usury is based on a moral judgment. This moral judgment now has the added argument of the ecological and social breakdown that the unlimited growth economy, driven by a debt-based compound interest monetary system, is creating. The alternative is to establish the monetary system as a public service supported like any other business with a fee-for-service income structure rather than a compound interest income structure. I think on that we're kind of all talking the same language. So this leads to a converging of two perspectives, two lenses on the current situation we're facing. From the standpoint of the human economy and society, the monetary reform lens focuses on changes in the system of money creation and regulation that would stabilize and equalize the money function in a public service context. From the standpoint of the whole earth economy, this lens focuses on the regulation of the money function in a way that preserves the integrity, resilience, and beauty of Earth's entire commonwealth of life. Toward this end, the money function should then be regulated as a licensed, which means restricted service providing secure, adequate, equitable, and ecologically sound access to the productive and assimilative capacity of Earth's life systems. Unless the monetary reform lens is incorporated within the whole earth economy lens, it contains no structural limitation on economic growth. Hence, the whole earth economy lens is needed to complete a monetary reform program that works to the whole commonwealth of life. How big is too big? I'll try to get through this, the rest of this, fairly quick, because I think what I just said is really the main point here. But in looking at what is too big, this is the question of scale. Economic growth is, in mainstream economics, economic growth is positive, and it's always desirable. The economy has no thermostat or shutoff valve. There is no such thing as too big. This means we have increased transport, increased extraction, increased waste, increased species loss. We have every curve on that page that I told you about in Gus Spetz's book looks like this, going back usually millennia, 1751, flat lines. All of a sudden you get into the 20th century and they shoot up like this. Loss of fisheries, loss of species, increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and so on. It's really a frightening array of information, and to me the defining set of information for our particular time in human history. We propose, as others have, we align ourselves in this book with those who promote the use of the IPAT framework for looking at the impact of humans on the ecology, which should then inform how we run our economy. And the framework here is that the impact of humans, which is now being represented often by ecological footprint, is a function of human population, affluence, which can also be seen in terms of consumption, technology, or the efficiency with which we use the productive capacity of the earth. We add the element of ethics, although some just assume that's incorporated within the other functions. The typical way that somebody like Geoffrey Sachs looks at this formula is that, don't worry about it, we can take care of everything with T. Most people who take a serious look, and we have very serious problems with Geoffrey Sachs' take on this, is that you can't avoid all the hard choices by just shoving everything into the T factor. We've got big problems with A, which is overconsumption, and we still have big problems with P, which is population. Ecological footprint, I hope you're all familiar with this term. It's basically a measure of how we're using the ability of the earth, the capacity of the earth, to produce, using the power of the sun, everything we consume, and to assimilate everything that we throw away. This is actually a graph that shows the footprint on a world scale. And basically you have countries in the development part of the world, the United States, Europe, where the problem is per capita footprint. Studies of footprint show that to have a sustainable use of the Earth's capacity to sustain life, we each get about 1.8 hectares. In the United States, the average is 9.6, almost 5 times too much. That means we're using the life capacity of the Earth 5 times more than it can regenerate. The world average is 2.2, and it's been higher than the sustainable average, remember 1.8. It's been higher than that average since sometime in the 1980s. We're living on ecological deficit. Climate change is the tip of the melting iceberg, so to speak, on this problem. So this is the overshoot line. When we get past this line in history, somewhere in the 1980s, we're in ecological deficit mode. This is the ecological challenge that our economy has to deal with. What's fair? Kenneth Boulding was a Quaker who in the 1960s came up with the metaphor of Earth as a spaceship. Pretty self-evident what that means. He also said it's a spaceship with 2 decks, one for the haves and one for the haves-not. 3 minutes? Okay. Mainstream economics says that the market decides what's efficient and how we should distribute its benefits and burdens. It's indifferent to initial or accidental endowments. You know, winning the lottery or having a rich daddy. This can result in increased or decreased equality. Typically, mainstream economics gives no accounting for the other species that have to share our Earth and on which we are interconnected. It ignores issues of carrying capacity and has an insufficient understanding of money. In a whole Earth economy, we call for in the book equity among humans, between humans and other species, and among generations of humans and other species. We think that the distribution should be in terms, not just in terms of money, but in a way that ties money ultimately to shares of net primary productivity, life support capacity, ecological footprint. If you think of money as a license to assert an ecological footprint, to take a piece of a limited ecological pie, it gives you a whole new perspective on how to look at this problem. Governance, new ways to stay in bounds and play fair. Do we want to leave this? I think we know who this guy is. This is Ben Bernanke. This is Mark Carney, his Canadian equivalent. So do we want to leave governance of our economy and our ecology to these folks? Well, we argue that we shouldn't. We propose the need for global institutions, one that will better govern the economy. A global reserve whose responsibility would be to monitor and analyze the ecological limits using the I versus I as a function of PATE framework. Trust to protect global commons, another book, another author who writes a lot about the use of trust is Peter Barnes. His book, Capitalism 3.0 and Who Owns the Sky are good books to read if you want to know more about that. Global federalism, well, I think most of the authors in this book it came in with kind of thinking that global government is a scary concept. You know, how are you going to manage, if things are so bad in our national governments, how are you going to make it better at the global scale? But we counter that with the attitude that the global economy is already being de facto run by a financial elite that is pushing on us this monetary system, not just at the national level, but at the international level, as the last speaker made clear, talking about debt of third world countries, is simply not acceptable. And then we also call for a judicial function to ensure accountability. Global federalism, well, we say, let's start by looking at the European model. Our conclusion, we recommend 4 steps to a whole Earth economy. First, the need to have grounding and clarification, a realization of the problem. We need to develop models, pilots, and techniques that are going to create a whole Earth economy. We need a mass epiphany where people start not just realizing, but walking the talk of a whole Earth economy. And we need nonviolent reform. In Quakerism, abolishing slavery is a leading model. Another picture that didn't come through. The slave ship Brooks was a slave ship that the Quakers in the 17th, 18th, probably 18th century, they distributed copies of drawings of this book to show the British people what slavery was all about. People jammed in like sardines, and it led to popular sentiment against slavery, and eventually to the end of slavery in Britain and the United States. This is a picture of Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King, other people from whom we take inspiration. So thanks very much.